Kellan Rook stood perfectly still before the expansive viewport of the deep space transport. Beyond the heavily reinforced glass, the Asterion Interstellar Academy hung suspended in the absolute, silent void of space. It looked like a colossal silver wheel rotating with a slow, agonizing majesty against the backdrop of a glittering cosmic nebula. The station caught the light of a distant, pale blue star, refracting blinding beams across its pristine, seamless metallic hull. It was breathtakingly beautiful. It was also unnervingly perfect. On Earth, monumental structures always bore the inevitable scars of the element's wind shear, tectonic shifts, the relentless battering of rain, and the slow decay of oxidized air. Here, Asterion was a monument to absolute, sterile control. He was not alone in the observation deck. Behind him in the staging bay stood three others, Tamsin, Garrick, and Nure. Together, the four of them made up the very first human cohort in the history of the galaxy to be accepted into the prestigious Interstellar Exchange Program. 100 years of Earth struggling to prove its sentience, its technological maturity, and its diplomatic restraint to the wider galactic community had culminated in this single, fragile moment. Yet, looking at the impossibly flawless architecture of the Academy, Kellan felt a distinct, cold prickle of unease at the base of his neck. His extensive background in extreme terrain rescue back home had permanently wired his brain to look for structural flaws, emergency escape routes, and contingency plans. Asterion looked like a place that had never needed a contingency plan. That, to his trained mind, was the most dangerous design philosophy of all. The transport docked with a soft, hydraulic hiss that vibrated gently through the floorboards. The main airlock cycled open, revealing a wide, arched umbilical corridor flooded with soft, synthetic daylight. Kellan adjusted the thick canvas straps of his heavily packed duffel bag. On Earth, the bag weighed nearly 90 pounds, packed tightly with emergency medical gear, dense reference manuals, and terrestrial survival rations. He gripped the heavy handle, braced his core, and prepared to heave the massive weight onto his shoulder. As his heavy combat boot crossed the threshold from the Earth Standard transport into the Academy proper, reality abruptly shifted. The artificial gravity on Asterion was drastically lower than the punishing pull of Earth. The massive duffel bag flew upward with the force of his violent pull, suddenly feeling no heavier than a child's hollow plastic toy. A lesser person might have lost their balance and launched themselves awkwardly into the ceiling, but Kellan's reflexes, honed by years of navigating sudden rock slides and unpredictable storm surges, kicked in instantly. He locked his abdominal muscles, bent his knees slightly to lower his center of gravity, and absorbed the unexpected kinetic upward drift, bringing the bag down smoothly and firmly against his side. It took him exactly 1.5 seconds to completely recalibrate his muscle memory to the new environment. Beside him, Garrick let out a low, amused breath, bouncing lightly on the balls of his feet to test the floor's resistance. Waiting for them at the end of the docking bridge was their designated orientation guide, Professor Pel. The professor was a striking, alien entity. Rex was a tall, slender crystalline being whose segmented, translucent body refracted the ambient corridor light into 1,000 tiny, shifting rainbows. As Rex moved forward to greet the new arrivals, the friction of their crystalline joints produced a resonant sound, exactly like glass wind chimes, caught in a gentle breeze. "Welcome, representatives of Earth," Professor Rex said. The voice was melodic, perfectly pitched, and impeccably polite. Yet Kellan, observant to a fault, immediately noticed the microscopic hesitation in the alien's posture. The professor maintained a deliberate, calculated physical distance of exactly 10 feet. The multifaceted crystalline structures around what served as Rx's eyes were clouded with a subtle, milky opacity. It was an unmistakable biological response. It was fear. Rx was actively fighting the urge to step backward. "I am Professor Pel," I have been assigned to escort you safely to your designated residential sector. Kellan nodded slowly, keeping his physical movements smooth, slow, and entirely predictable so as not to startle the guide. Lead the way, Professor. They followed the chiming crystalline guide out of the secure docking sector and stepped into the main academic concourse. The sheer architectural scale of the space was staggering. High, vaulted ceilings made of transparent glass steel revealed the spinning cosmos directly above them. Elegant walkways of polished white alloy crisscrossed the immense, open atrium. However, the magnificent architecture was quickly overshadowed by the suffocating atmosphere that descended upon them. The concourse was packed with hundreds of alien students from dozens of distinct species. There were floating entities composed of dense gas, chitinous insectoids with delicate mandibles, elegant, amphibious bipeds draped in fine silks, and hovering spheres of sentient, crackling plasma. Yet, as the four humans walked down the central thoroughfare, a profound, chilling silence rippled outward like a shockwave. Hundreds of lively conversations died in an instant. The students froze in their tracks. Then, a collective panic set in. The crowds actively parted, scrambling backward over one another to create a massive, empty buffer zone around the Terrans. Wide, unblinking eyes, compound optical sensors, and thermal pits all locked entirely onto the humans. They were not looking at Kellan and his team as fellow scholars or curious newcomers. They were staring intently, as if witnessing terrifying apex predators ripped straight out of a dark, forbidden mythology. To the wider, civilized galaxy, Earth was a notoriously brutal death world. It was a planetary anomaly, defined by crushing high gravity, highly corrosive oxygen, chaotic weather patterns, and predatory violence. To see four survivors of that hellish world walking casually through their pristine, safe halls was a paralyzing sight. Suddenly, the tense silence was broken by the sharp, high-pitched hum of anti-gravity repulsors. A station security drone, a sleek, silver orb roughly the size of a human head, detached violently from the vaulted ceiling and plummeted toward the group. It halted abruptly, hovering mere inches from Kellan's chest. A fan of piercing azure light swept systematically over him. Kellan stood perfectly still, letting the autonomous machine do its intrusive work. The drone's internal audiols clicked and whirred as it processed the data. Then, it broadcasted its findings in a sterile, synthesized voice that echoed loudly across the completely silent concourse. Subject scanning complete. Biometric anomaly detected. Bone density exceeds standard Academy parameters by 300%. Muscle fiber density exceeds standard parameters by 450%. Ambient resting heart rate indicates extreme cardiovascular efficiency. Microkinetic tremors detected. Subject is constantly adjusting to low gravity, harboring immense suppressed kinetic force. The soothing blue light snapped instantly to a harsh, glaring crimson. A holographic projection materialized directly above Kellan's head, flashing rhythmically in bright red galactic basic syntax. Adaptive high-risk organism. Extreme caution advised. A collective, terrified gasp shuddered through the gathered alien student body. Several of the more fragile avian species instinctively took flight, retreating frantically to the higher rafters to escape the ground-level threat. Professor Pel's crystalline structure chimed wildly, a clear acoustic sign of severe distress, though the professor tried valiantly to maintain a facade of professional composure. Kellan looked calmly at the glaring red warning label floating above his own head, then glanced back over his shoulder at his team. Tamsin merely raised a skeptical eyebrow. Nure sighed quietly, and Garrick just offered a lopsided smirk. Kellan turned his attention back to the hovering drone, his facial expression completely neutral, his breathing steady, and his heart rate never spiking by even a single beat per minute. He simply shifted the weight of his bag and looked patiently at the terrified professor. "Shall we continue our tour?" Kellan asked, his voice calm, deeply grounded, and entirely out of place in the panicked, charged atmosphere. RX gave a stiff, jerky nod and hastily led them away from the frozen crowd, navigating the group through a series of increasingly isolated corridors. The graceful, fragile architecture of the main concourse gradually gave way to heavier, deeply reinforced bulkheads. The lighting grew slightly dimmer, shifting from warm, ambient glows to harsh, utilitarian overhead strips. Finally, they arrived at a dead end featuring a massive door constructed of dense, impact-resistant titanium alloy. It looked completely alien compared to the elegant, sliding acoustic panels they had seen decorating the other student dormitories along the way. Kellan stepped forward and looked closely at the digital plaque mounted next to the heavy biometric hand scanner. He had expected to see something welcoming, perhaps a standard greeting for the new cultural exchange program. Instead, the automatically translated text glowed in bright warning colors, displaying a stark, uncompromising truth. Extreme endurance, species habitat. Class 9, biohazard containment protocols in effect. Kellan reached out and placed his bare hand firmly on the scanner. The heavy locking mechanisms disengaged with a series of loud, industrial thuds that echoed down the quiet hallway. A sound quite unlike the silent grace of the rest of the station. As the thick, heavy vault door slid open to reveal their austere, heavily armored living quarters, Kellan felt a profound, crystal-clear realization wash over his mind. He looked at the deeply reinforced walls, the heavy-duty atmospheric air scrubbers mounted on the ceiling, and the thick emergency lockdown seals framing the entrance. From the very first moment he had set foot on the transport ship back on Earth, he had wondered exactly how the wider galaxy would receive them. Now, looking at this bunker, he knew the absolute truth. In this shining, perfect, and peaceful beacon of interstellar learning, human beings were not considered esteemed guests. They were not even considered normal students. They were a living, breathing stress test. And Kellan Rook, a man who had spent his entire adult life pulling desperate people out of the violent, crushing jaws of an unforgiving planet, knew exactly how to survive a test. The orientation auditorium was deliberately designed to evoke a sense of absolute tranquility, complete with soft ambient lighting and temperature-controlled synthetic moss covering the circular seating tiers. Yet, the atmosphere currently felt more like a high-stakes tribunal. The 4 Terrans were seated in the dead center of the amphitheater, isolated in a sunken pit, while several hundred alien students and faculty observed them from the safety of the elevated galleries behind reinforced energy shields. Hovering directly above the humans was a massive, high-definition holographic projection of Earth. To Kellan, it looked like home. To the rest of the room, it was a swirling blue and green sphere of absolute biological terror. A synthesized voice, painfully polite but laced with institutional dread, narrated the planetary statistics. It described an atmospheric composition consisting of 21% highly corrosive, highly reactive oxygen. It detailed an active, molten iron core, generating a magnetic field born from violent kinetic friction, and a gravitational pull that would instantly liquefy the internal organs of roughly 70% of the known civilized galaxy. The hologram zoomed in, showcasing a spectacular montage of terrestrial weather patterns, a massive Category 5 hurricane churning over the Atlantic, a jagged fork of lightning splitting the night sky over a sprawling metropolis, a raging forest fire consuming miles of dense timber. Murmurs of genuine horror rippled through the observing crowd. The aliens watched in pale, wide-eyed disbelief as the presentation explained that human beings routinely built their permanent settlements in zones prone to tectonic ruptures, seasonal cyclones, and sub-zero blizzards. A collective, horrified gasp echoed through the acoustic chamber when the narrator politely noted that humanity had tamed its environment by actively utilizing uncontrolled, uncontained exothermic chemical reactions. Or, as humans called it, fire. The idea of cooking organic matter over an open, flesh-incinerating flame in the middle of a domestic dwelling caused an amphibian dignitary in the front row to visibly swoon. Kellan sat with his arms crossed over his chest, listening to the terrified whispers. He tapped his foot once, a slow, deliberate rhythm against the polished alloy floor. Beside him, Tamsin was desperately trying to stifle a laugh behind her hand, while Garrick looked entirely bored, staring blankly at the ceiling. Nure simply shook her head in mild disbelief. Professor Pel stood at the podium, their crystalline structure rigidly locked in an uncomfortable posture. Oryx gestured elegantly toward a glowing data terminal positioned in front of Kellan. "Mr. Rook," the professor said, the chiming voice attempting to sound entirely routine. "Before we proceed to your academic schedules, the Academy administration requires the human delegation to formally acknowledge a series of specialized behavioral waivers." Kellan leaned forward, tapping the screen to scroll through the dense, glowing text. The legal documents were staggering in their sheer paranoia. He read the first clause aloud, his voice steady and flat. Clause 1. I agree to refrain from striking any residential entryways with my knuckles to request entry, as human bone density combined with standard Terran muscular acceleration will shatter standard Academy acoustic panels. Kellan blinked. They were legally banning him from knocking on doors. He scrolled further. Clause 4. I agree to lower my body mass onto standard seating apparatuses at a controlled velocity, not exceeding 1 meter per second, to prevent sudden catastrophic structural failure of the furniture. He was not allowed to sit down too fast. He kept reading. Clause 9. I agree to entirely abstain from the traditional human greeting known as a handshake, unless the recipient has secured prior biological clearance, a heavy-duty kinetic brace, and explicit written consent from the medical bay. Kellan sighed, pressing his thumb against the biometric pad to sign the absurd documents. I promise not to aggressively sit on your chairs or accidentally crush anyone's hands. Professor, is there anything else? Before Oryx could respond, a sharp, commanding voice cut through the auditorium. This is an absolute farce. A tall, elegantly angular student rose from the front tier of the gallery. He belonged to a proud, feline-like species, with sleek, silver fur and piercing violet eyes. His posture radiated aristocratic superiority, completely lacking the nervous trembling that afflicted the rest of the student body. His tailored academic robes marked him as a high-ranking senior scholar. Representative Serik, please maintain decorum, Oryx warned, though the crystalline professor sounded notably hesitant to challenge the student. Serik ignored the reprimand entirely. He pointed a long, clawed finger directly at the four humans. Decorum. You are asking us to welcome biological siege engines into a facility dedicated to fragile, high-concept theoretical research. You just showed us a world where the atmosphere itself oxidizes metal, and the dominant species uses localized plasma bursts to prepare their meals. Bringing Deathworlders into Asterion is not a cultural exchange. It is a wildly irresponsible, deeply unethical gamble with the lives of every civilized student on this station. A wave of affirmative murmuring swept through the gallery. Serik had vocalized the exact terror that everyone else was too polite to say out loud. Kellan did not rise to the bait. He simply stood up from his specialized, reinforced chair. He needed to stretch his legs, and the intense scrutiny was becoming tiresome. He took a few steps toward the edge of the pit, moving to give Serik a clearer line of sight to address him directly. As Kellan shifted his weight to the side to yield the center of the floor to his team, he casually rested his right hand against the polished, decorative waist-high railing that separated the sunken pit from the walkways. It was a completely unconscious movement, a simple, relaxed lean. A sharp, metallic shriek echoed through the dead-silent auditorium. The incredibly advanced, ultra-lightweight space-age alloy of the railing buckled under the casual weight of the Terran. The metal groaned in protest, warping and bending downward by a couple of millimeters, permanently deforming the perfect, seamless curve of the barrier. Kellan froze. He looked down at his hand. Then, at the slightly dented railing. He had barely applied a fraction of his body weight. The entire auditorium recoiled. Hundreds of students physically pushed themselves backward into their seats. The silence that followed was absolute, suffocating, and dripping with unadulterated horror. They had just watched a human casually crush military-grade station architecture by simply leaning against it to relax. Professor Oryx's chimes rang out in a frantic, chaotic clatter. The alien rushed to the edge of the podium, raising both hands in a desperate attempt to pacify the terrified crowd. "Please, everyone, remain calm," Oryx projected, the melodic voice straining slightly. "The administration has already accounted for these kinetic discrepancies. The human delegation will not be permitted to roam freely. They are strictly mandated to complete a comprehensive, rigorous series of academy safety courses before they are granted access to the fragile academic wings or the primary research laboratories." The crowd slowly stopped whispering, though their eyes remained locked on the dented railing. The promise of mandatory safety training seemed to offer them a thin, desperate layer of psychological comfort. If the humans could be taught the rigid, infallible safety protocols of Asterion, perhaps they could be contained. Down in the pit, Kellan slipped his hands into his pockets. He felt absolutely no anger toward Serik's accusations or the crowd's terror. Honestly, he found the entire situation profoundly ironic. This magnificent, shining academy genuinely believed that humanity was dangerously ignorant of safety. They thought humans needed to be taught how to avoid hazards. They did not understand what it meant to be human. Kellan had grown up on the stormy coastlines of Earth. His mother had been a deep-sea rescue diver, and his father, a structural engineer specializing in earthquake retrofitting. Kellan had been raised on a very specific, unforgiving doctrine. To the people of Asterion, safety was a guarantee. It was an environmental constant, maintained by flawless artificial intelligence and indestructible force fields. It was a comfortable, warm feeling of absolute certainty. But to Kellan, safety was not a feeling at all. Safety was an action. Safety was knowing exactly how many seconds you had before a failing oxygen valve completely blew out. Safety was knowing how to tie a proper double figure-8 knot in the dark while freezing rain battered your face. Safety was the brutal, pragmatic knowledge of exactly what to do when every single perfect system shattered into a million pieces. The orientation concluded shortly after the railing incident, with the alien students filing out in a rapid, highly organized retreat, leaving a wide berth around the human exit. As RX gathered the data pads and signaled for the auditorium systems to power down, Kellan stood alone near the exit doors, waiting for his team. Above him, the massive, meticulously maintained overhead lighting array provided a flawless wash of pure, white, synthetic sunlight. It was controlled by the station's omnipotent guardian mesh, an artificial intelligence that boasted a flawless operational record spanning 140 years. Suddenly, the light shifted. It was not a blackout. It was not even a proper flicker. It was an incredibly minute, almost imperceptible drop in voltage. The light dimmed for exactly one fraction of a second, an asynchronous heartbeat in the electrical grid that vanished as quickly as it appeared. Out of the hundreds of intelligent beings leaving the room, no one noticed it. The advanced sensors of the alien students did not register it as a threat. The automated maintenance drones did not issue an alert. The flawless system simply ignored the anomaly. But Kellan saw it. His eyes evolved to catch the sudden, subtle shifts of a predator in the brush, or the first silent flash of lightning behind thick storm clouds. Caught the unnatural stutter. He stared up at the ceiling, his jaw tightening. Asterion paraded itself as the safest place in the known universe. But as Kellan walked out of the room, he knew with absolute certainty that the flawless machine was quietly, secretly skipping a beat. And on a death world, a skipped beat was always the first warning before the avalanche. The thermal dynamic containment lab was bathed in a pulsing crimson warning light. An environmental hazard siren wailed a rhythmic, high-pitched two-tone warning that set the teeth of every alien student in the room on edge. Behind a thick partition of energy-shielded glass, a piece of experimental hyperalloy rested inside a magnetic crucible, glowing an angry, blinding orange. The digital readout above the workstation displayed a surface temperature of 800 degrees Celsius. It was officially classified as a red-level thermal emergency. Tamsin Vale casually reached out and picked it up. A collective shriek of pure panic erupted from the other side of the safety glass. The instructor, an amorphous cephalopod encased in a biosuit, frantically slapped the emergency lockdown button, convinced he was about to witness a student vaporize her own upper limb. Tamsin simply turned the glowing ingot over in her hands, inspecting the weld line. She was wearing a standard-issue Terran industrial work glove, woven from a highly mundane blend of Kevlar and heat-resistant Nomex. To the Academy, handling a red-level hazard required a remote-operated drone or a localized stasis field. To a human who had spent 2 summers working in an orbital shipyard, welding hull plates, it just felt like holding a warm cup of coffee on a winter morning. She placed the ingot back into the crucible, completely oblivious to the fact that her classmates were huddled together, weeping in sheer biological terror. The situation did not improve in the advanced navigation courses. Later that afternoon, Kellan sat inside a sleek, immersive flight simulator, tasked with charting an emergency orbital insertion around a collapsing gas giant. Asterion students were taught to interface seamlessly with the Guardian mesh, utilizing the supreme artificial intelligence to plot millions of micro-adjustments per second. Midway through the exercise, Kellan's terminal froze. The holographic interface glitched, dissolved into a spray of static, and completely locked up. The simulation registered a catastrophic primary computer failure. Standard Academy protocol for this scenario was simple: initiate the distress beacon, enter cryosleep, and pray for rescue. Kellan let out a quiet sigh. He unbuckled his harness, reached into his cargo pocket, and pulled out a grease pencil. He leaned forward and began writing directly on the glass surface of the frozen monitor. Within 2 minutes, he had mapped out a localized coordinate grid. Within 4 minutes, utilizing basic Newtonian physics, orbital mechanics, and manual delta-v calculations, he found the exact vector required to slingshot out of the gravity well. He keyed the manual thruster overrides, inputted the burn times by hand, and successfully cleared the hazard zone. When the simulation pod opened, the entire lecture hall was staring at him in dead, suffocating silence. The professor, a towering avian scholar, looked as though he might faint. They could not comprehend a civilization that actually taught its youth how to manually perform complex celestial calculations in the event that a machine stopped thinking for them. It was considered an archaic, almost barbaric practice, like navigating by looking at the stars. The utter disconnect between Terran pragmatism and alien fragility reached its peak during the midday meal. The Academy cafeteria was a sprawling pavilion of synthesized culinary perfection. Garrick Saul, frustrated by the bland, nutrient-optimized paste the dispensers provided, had gone exploring. He returned to the human table, carrying a small vial of red liquid clearly labeled as an artificial capsaicin compound, utilized strictly by the maintenance drones for extreme microbial waste processing. Garrick splashed a generous amount onto his nutrient paste and took a massive bite. 3 students at the adjacent table, recognizing the chemical warning label, immediately triggered a medical emergency alert. They watched in absolute horror, fully expecting the human to clutch his throat and dissolve from the inside out. "Not bad," Garrick mumbled, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "A little spicy." Needs salt, though. The three alien students abandoned their trays and fled the pavilion. Moments later, Nure accidentally caught her forearm on the sharp edge of a metallic data slate, leaving a shallow but bleeding scratch near her wrist. Rather than visiting the medical bay for a restorative dermal regeneration cycle, she simply pulled a small plastic bottle of standard isopropyl alcohol from her bag. She uncapped it, splashed the harsh chemical directly onto an absorbent pad, and pressed it hard against the open wound. The sharp, pungent scent of the medical alcohol drifted across the tables. Several nearby species, possessing highly sensitive olfactory glands, gagged. They watched the human willingly pour a burning, toxic solvent directly into her own bloodstream, without flinching. Whispers rapidly spread that the humans practiced sick, masochistic rituals of pain endurance just to digest their meals. It was in the middle of this tense atmosphere that a tiny student named Sivri approached their table. Sivri belonged to a small, mammalian species with enormous, luminous eyes and trembling, tufted ears. She looked at Kellan, her voice barely a whisper above the ambient hum of the cafeteria. "Excuse me," Sivri squeaked, clutching her datapad tightly to her chest. "I was reading the leaked terrestrial data files. Is it true that human children are taught how to bind bleeding wounds, escape burning structures, filter toxic water, and brace for extreme weather events when they are only 6 years old?" The surrounding tables went completely quiet. Every ear, antenna, and auditory membrane strained to hear the answer. They assumed it was a lie, a piece of exaggerated propaganda meant to make humans sound tough. Kellan looked down at the tiny alien. He did not smile, nor did he try to soften the reality of his home. He spoke clearly, his voice carrying across the silent dining hall. "Yes, it is true." Sivri blinked, her large eyes welling with a mix of pity and horror. "But why would your elders subject small, innocent younglings to such terrifying concepts? Why not wait until they are fully grown and capable?" Kellan stopped eating. He met her gaze with a flat, unwavering intensity. "Because where I am from, danger does not wait for adults to arrive before it strikes." The cafeteria remained dead silent for a full 60 seconds after he spoke. The stark, brutal honesty of his words shattered the comfortable illusion of the academy. It was a terrifying reminder that the universe was not a polite place, and the humans were the only ones who actually understood that. Unbeknownst to the humans, every single one of these incidents was being meticulously recorded. Serik, the aristocratic student who had publicly condemned their arrival, was covertly capturing audio and video logs of the Terran group from a safe distance. Using a decentralized, encrypted peer-to-peer network, Serik was broadcasting the footage to the entire student body. Within 48 hours, the Terran exchange students became the most explosive topic in the history of Asterion. They were terrifying. They were fascinating. They were an absolute biological impossibility. The debates raged in the dormitories and the lecture halls. Some viewed them as walking disasters waiting to happen, while others developed a morbid, obsessive curiosity about the unkillable Deathworlders. But while the entire student population was completely distracted by the spectacle of humanity, Kellan Rook was focused on something else entirely. His mind kept returning to the frozen navigation simulator. He began to pay closer attention to his surroundings, utilizing the situational awareness that had kept him alive on Earth. He noticed that the automated transit doors in the eastern wing took exactly 1.5 seconds longer to open than they had yesterday. He observed a cleaning drone repeatedly mopping a perfectly dry section of the floor until its battery depleted. When he requested the atmospheric data for their dormitory block, the terminal hesitated, spat out a string of contradictory thermal metrics, and then completely altered his search query to a recipe for synthetic water. The Academy was terrified of the humans breaking their perfect world, but Kellan could see the invisible fractures spreading through the foundation. The Guardian Mesh, The infallible artificial intelligence that kept them all breathing in the vacuum of space was fundamentally sick. It was responding slowly. It was making illogical choices. The humans were not the most dangerous thing on Asterion. The most dangerous thing was a perfect system that was quietly losing its mind, surrounded by thousands of people who had completely forgotten how to survive without it. The deep archives of Asterion were the only place on the entire station that actually felt old. While the upper promenades were all polished glass steel and seamless white alloy, the subterranean data vaults were dimly lit, smelling faintly of ozone and warm silicon. It was here that Kellan found a quiet refuge from the constant, paranoid stares of the general student body. It was also here that he found his first real allies. Leoz was an archival student of a cephalopod-descended species, possessing a soft, malleable body and a deeply shy demeanor. Leoz communicated mostly through shifts in skin pigmentation and soft clicks, preferring the company of ancient physical data drives to living beings. Varen was the exact opposite, a towering, bipedal reptilian studying zero-gravity physical kinematics. Varen possessed scales the color of oxidized copper and a fearsome, jagged jawline. Yet, despite a terrifying outward appearance, Varen was incredibly gentle and fiercely proud of his academic standing, often refusing to ask for help out of sheer, stubborn pride. The three of them sat around a glowing terminal in the darkest corner of the vault. Kellan was scrolling through centuries of public maintenance logs. He tapped the glass screen, highlighting a sweeping graph that remained completely flat for its entire duration. 140 years, Kellan muttered, his voice echoing softly against the server racks. Asterion has been operating for 140 years. According to this, there has not been a single major structural failure. No atmospheric venting, no localized fires, no gravitational inversions. Nothing. Leoz shifted to a soft, agreeable shade of blue. The records are accurate. Kellan, the Academy is a beacon of absolute security. Varen puffed out his chest, his scales rattling slightly. It is the pinnacle of galactic engineering. Why do you look so disappointed? Would you prefer the walls to occasionally explode? Terran. No, Kellan replied, leaning back in his chair. I just do not believe it. Statistically, it is impossible. Machines break, metal fatigues, micrometeorites slip through the deflector nets. A flawless record spanning more than a century does not mean the system is perfect. It means the system is hiding its scars. The next morning, Kellan brought his suspicions directly to their designated guide. Professor Pel was leading the human cohort through a sprawling, sunlit botanical sector. The crystalline alien listened patiently as Kellan questioned the impossibility of the station's spotless safety rating. You are applying terrestrial limitations to an interstellar marvel. Mr. Rook, Oryx explained, the melodic chime of their voice ringing with absolute certainty. Asterion does not merely react to danger. It preempts it. The secret is the Guardian Mesh. It is not a localized computer. It is an ambient artificial intelligence woven directly into the living synthetic materials of the station itself. Oryx gestured toward a massive load-bearing pillar. The mesh monitors molecular stress. It predicts the exact millisecond a valve will fail, and it redirects the pressure days before a fracture can even form. It calculates the trajectory of every moving object, neutralizing kinetic threats before they manifest. It is a symbiotic web of absolute foresight. Kellan stared at the seemingly perfect pillar. He felt a deep, unsettling chill. He had grown up strictly adhering to a core philosophy imparted by his mother, a veteran deep-sea rescue diver who had spent her life pulling crews out of flooded pressure habitats. She had drilled one fundamental truth into his head: the more perfect the system, the more people forget how to react when the system inevitably fails. Asterion had eradicated the concept of hazard, and in doing so, it had successfully eradicated the instinct for survival. This dangerous complacency became violently apparent during their required emergency evacuation practicum. The exercise took place in a multi-level simulated structural labyrinth. The objective was simple: navigate from the lowest deck to the upper staging area before the simulated biotoxin flooded the zone. When the starting klaxon blared, the floor illuminated with bright green arrows, perfectly curated by the Guardian mesh to guide the students along the safest, widest corridors. Kellan started running. He followed the green path for exactly 2 minutes before he noticed the simulated crowd of alien students bottlenecking at a primary stairwell. The AI was routing everyone through the same wide artery, prioritizing orderly movement over speed. Kellan did not stop. He veered sharply off the glowing path. He spotted a narrow, vertical maintenance shaft marked with heavy yellow warning stripes. It was cramped, unlit, and bypassed 3 distinct safe zones. He grabbed the heavy latch, tore the grate off the wall, and climbed straight up through the dark, ascending 4 levels in a matter of seconds. He kicked open the top grate and stepped into the safe zone, finishing the exercise in less than half the expected time. He was not greeted with a passing grade. The moment his boots hit the floor, his personal terminal flashed a harsh crimson. A localized speaker barked a mechanical reprimand. Evacuation failure. Unsafe thinking detected. Subject willfully abandoned the verified Guardian transit corridor. Subject engaged with restricted physical infrastructure. Such actions introduce unpredictable variables into the safety matrix. The system did not care that he had survived faster than anyone else. It only cared that he had disobeyed the pre-calculated algorithm. The real world proved far worse than the simulation. The moment the practicum ended and the students filed out into the main transit corridor, the atmosphere abruptly changed. A sharp, mechanical hiss sliced through the air. A microfracture in a localized atmospheric distributor had triggered a sudden, localized drop in air pressure. It was incredibly minor. Nothing more than a sudden pop in the ears and a brief rush of cold wind. But the reaction of the academy was horrifying. Dozens of students instantly froze in place. They did not run. They did not seek cover. They simply stopped breathing, their eyes wide with terror, their bodies locked in perfect stillness as they waited for the overhead speakers to tell them exactly what to do. The Guardian mesh was supposed to fix it automatically, so they had completely surrendered their own agency. Kellan did not wait. He pinpointed the source of the hiss, a loose diagnostic panel on the bulkhead. He stepped through the crowd of paralyzed aliens, drove his fingers into the seam of the panel, and ripped it open with a sharp wrench of his shoulders. Inside, a pressurized conduit was vibrating violently. Kellan immediately identified the manual override wheel, gripped the cold metal, and wrenched it clockwise. The hissing stopped. The pressure stabilized. The students blinked, slowly, snapping out of their terrified trance. They stared at Kellan, their expressions caught somewhere between immense relief and profound horror. He had just manually manipulated the station's sacred veins. 10 minutes later, Kellan was standing in the private office of Professor Pel. The crystalline entity paced behind their desk, the chiming sounds of their joints sharp and erratic. "I must speak plainly, Mr. Rook," Oryx said, keeping their voice low. "Your terrestrial reflexes were highly efficient. You stabilized a minor fluctuation 2 seconds faster than the automated maintenance drones could arrive. Privately, I am fascinated. But publicly, you are a localized disaster." Oryx stopped pacing and pointed a long, translucent finger at the window. "They saw you bypass the mesh. They saw you act without an algorithm. It terrifies them. The administration is demanding action. Therefore, I am forced to increase the active drone surveillance on the entire Terran cohort. You will be monitored at all times. We cannot risk you causing a panic by simply existing outside the parameters." Kellan accepted the reprimand with a slow, solemn nod. He knew arguing would change nothing. The Academy was addicted to its own illusion of control. But that illusion was about to shatter. At exactly 2 o'clock in the morning, Kellan was awake in his heavily armored dormitory. The reinforced door let out a soft, barely audible scratch. Kellan moved silently, disengaging the heavy lock. Liaz slipped into the room, their skin a mottled, anxious gray. The archival student was trembling. Without speaking a word, Liaz reached into their robes and handed Kellan an extremely old, physical data slate. It was heavy, practically archaic, and completely disconnected from the station's wireless network. Kellan powered it on. A flickering wireframe map of Asterion illuminated the dark room. But it was not the map the Academy provided to the public. "I found this in the deepest physical vault," Liaz whispered, their voice trembling with genuine fear. "It is a schematic from the original founding cycle." Kellan traced a finger down the glowing lines. Far beneath the glamorous academic wings, below the deep archives, and heavily separated by thick, black lines indicating structural ceiling, was an entire level that did not officially exist. It was a massive, sprawling technical underbelly. "The administration sealed it off 80 years ago," Liaz continued, stepping back toward the door. "It is a dead zone, Kellan. The Guardian mesh has absolutely no sensors down there. It is the one place on the entire station where the system is completely blind." Kellan stared at the hidden labyrinth on the screen. His instincts, honed by years of hunting for the weakest link in a broken chain, flared to life. The perfect machine was hiding something in the dark. The highly anticipated station-wide evacuation drill was scheduled for precisely 0900 hours. For 3 weeks, the Academy administration had heavily promoted the event across the internal network, branding it as the first comprehensive safety exercise to officially incorporate the new terrestrial variable. The underlying message was clear to everyone: the humans were finally going to learn how civilized species handled controlled emergencies. Kellan stood in the center of the primary botanical concourse, surrounded by roughly 400 alien students. The ambient temperature was a perfect 22 degrees Celsius. The artificial sunlight beamed down through the vaulted glass steel ceiling. When the starting klaxon finally sounded, it was a polite, rhythmic chime, designed specifically not to startle the more sensitive auditory systems of the student body. Orderly lines formed instantly. The students moved with practiced, serene precision, their eyes glued to the glowing green arrows projected onto the polished floorboards. Then, at exactly 12 minutes past the hour, the illusion of control shattered. The warm, synthetic sunlight snapped off completely. It was not a dimming effect. It was an abrupt, violent plunge into pitch blackness. A fraction of a second later, the heavy titanium fire bulkheads, which were supposed to descend in a staggered, wave-like sequence to safely herd the crowd, slammed down all at once. The concourse was instantly compartmentalized, trapping hundreds of students in isolated pockets. A sharp hiss echoed through the dark. Thick, freezing white mist began pouring aggressively from the overhead environmental vents. It was industrial coolant, rapidly dropping the ambient room temperature to near freezing. Yet, nobody panicked. The students simply stopped walking. Accustomed to a lifetime of flawless simulations, they stood perfectly still in the expanding frost, shivering violently, waiting patiently for the Guardian mesh to project the next set of instructions. They truly believed this was merely an advanced, immersive phase of the drill. Kellan knew instantly it was not. His eyes snapped to the primary digital navigation bulkhead above the sealed exit. The screen was strobing wildly. In bright, frantic lettering, the artificial intelligence was broadcasting 2 completely contradictory emergency routes simultaneously. The left side of the screen flashed an order to seek immediate shelter in Sector 4, while the right side displayed a critical warning to evacuate Sector 4 immediately due to a lethal pressure vacuum. A perfect system did not contradict itself. The machine was having a stroke. The temperature plummeted further. The coolant mist grew dense, reducing visibility to less than 5 feet. Several cold-blooded reptilian students began to slow down, their biological systems shutting down as hypothermia set in at an unnatural speed. Kellan dropped the polite, restrained facade he had maintained since his arrival. "Move!" Kellan roared, his voice cutting through the freezing mist like a physical shockwave. He did not care about interstellar decorum anymore. "This is not a drill. The system is blind. Move away from the vents right now." The sheer, booming volume of the Terran's voice shattered the paralyzing trance of the alien crowd. He plunged into the thick fog, grabbing paralyzed students by their shoulders and physically shoving them toward the eastern wall, away from the descending coolant clouds. He organized them into clusters of 10 on the fly, barking short, brutal commands to the taller species to grab hold of the smaller ones. "Do not wait for the lights. Follow the wall. Keep your hands on the person in front of you." He reached the Eastern Auxiliary emergency door, which was supposed to default to an open position during a power failure. Instead, the heavy alloy panel had jammed halfway down, leaving a gap of only 3 feet. Beside the jammed door, 2 fragile avian students had completely collapsed, their hollow bones and delicate respiratory systems unable to process the freezing, dense chemical mist. They were unconscious, their feathers rapidly frosting over. Kellan did not waste a single second looking for a manual override switch that was clearly dead. He dropped into a low crouch, wedged his fingers under the thick, freezing lower edge of the jammed bulkhead, and braced his boots against the floor. He tapped into the dense, high-gravity muscle mass that terrified the rest of the station, letting out a sharp grunt as he drove his legs upward. The grinding shriek of protesting titanium echoed loudly over the chaos. Kellan forced the heavy door up another 2 feet by sheer, agonizing brute force. His muscles burned, but the gap was now wide enough. He shouted at a paralyzed amphibious student to hold the heavy latch mechanism in place, then ducked back into the lethal fog. He scooped up the 2 unconscious avian students, tucking them under his arms like fragile bundles of kindling. He ducked under the suspended bulkhead, threw himself into the narrow, unlit technical shaft beyond it, and kicked the door seal free behind him. He navigated the pitch-black, cramped maintenance tunnel purely by touch and spatial memory, carrying the 2 limp bodies upward for 3 grueling levels until he finally kicked out a ventilation grate and dragged them out into a stable, brightly lit secondary medical corridor. Within 2 hours, the Academy administration managed to manually override the chaotic environmental systems and restore order. But the damage to the station's psychological foundation was already done. Security drones had automatically recorded the entire incident in the dark via thermal imaging. By midday, the raw footage had bypassed the official censors and spread like wildfire across the encrypted student network. Every student on the station watched the thermal silhouette of the Terran exchange student holding up a crushed titanium bulkhead with his bare hands. They watched him plunge into lethal chemical fog without a protective suit, dragging dying classmates out of the dark while the supposedly flawless artificial intelligence failed them. For the very first time since the humans had arrived on Asterion, the whispered conversations in the dining halls changed. The alien students did not look at Kellan as a reckless, violent monster. They looked at him as a creature who knew exactly how to navigate the terrifying abyss of chaos. He was no longer the threat. He was the only one who knew how to fight the threat. The Academy administration, however, did not share this newfound reverence. By 1600 hours, Kellan was standing in front of a disciplinary tribunal in the highest administrative spire. 3 senior deans, their faces tight with suppressed outrage, aggressively reprimanded him. "You directly bypassed the official chain of command, Mr. Rook," the presiding dean stated, slamming a metallic hand against the desk. "You deliberately broke a localized quarantine seal and entered an unverified technical zone without explicit system clearance. You could have introduced the chemical contaminant into the safe sectors." Kellan stood with his hands locked behind his back, his expression stony. The system was ordering them to march into a vacuum. Dean, if I had waited for clearance, you would be processing 2 dead students right now, instead of yelling at me. The Guardian mesh experienced a localized data loop. It was resolving the conflict. The Dean fired back, though the desperation in his voice was glaring. Your unpredictable kinetic interference only disrupted the diagnostic sequence. They dismissed him with a severe warning and a restriction of his academic privileges. Kellan did not care about the punishment. His mind was entirely focused on what he had seen just before the tribunal began. While waiting in the antechamber, he had casually glanced at an administrative terminal left unattended by a panicked clerk. The screen was displaying the raw incident report for the coolant malfunction, tracing the origin of the logic cascade that had scrambled the emergency protocols. The administration scrubbed the exact coordinates from the system only a few minutes later, replacing it with a fabricated report of a faulty sensor relay. But Kellan possessed a photographic memory for spatial layouts. He had memorized the localized origin point before it vanished. The catastrophic error had not originated in the botanical concourse. It had not come from the environmental control decks. The cascade had started deep below the surface of the station. It had originated directly beneath the sealed technical level Liaz had shown him on the ancient map. The blind spot in the perfect machine was not empty. Something down there in the dark was deliberately ripping the artificial intelligence apart. By 0700 hours the following morning, the fragile admiration the station had developed for the humans completely evaporated. The data logs from the previous day's catastrophic system failure had been compiled, analyzed, and swiftly weaponized. Kellan awoke to the harsh glare of 3 security drones hovering directly outside the reinforced window of his quarters. A glowing digital mandate had been plastered across the human dormitory's primary exit. The administration had traced the origin of the coolant malfunction. According to the newly fabricated network logs, the catastrophic override had been initiated from a secondary data node registered directly to the Terran living sector. The rumor mill of Asterion operated with terrifying efficiency. Within 2 hours, the narrative completely flipped. The heroic rescue in the botanical concourse was recontextualized into a sinister, calculated psychological operation. The alien student body, desperate for a tangible scapegoat, rather than admitting their flawless machine was broken, eagerly swallowed the lie. The humans had deliberately sabotaged the environmental controls. They had orchestrated a lethal crisis solely to demonstrate the biological superiority of Deathworlders and to seize cultural dominance over the fragile academic hierarchy. The human cohort was immediately stripped of all laboratory clearances. 4 additional security escorts were permanently assigned to their detail, their heavy metallic footfalls echoing behind the Terrans wherever they walked. The administration forced them to wear thick, restrictive biometric tracking bracelets that pulsed with a dull, yellow warning light. They were confined to the central transit arteries, effectively isolated and treated as hostile insurgents. Tamsin was furious, pacing the common room and threatening to tear the tracking bracelet off her wrist with her bare hands. Garrick sat in tense silence, while Nure calmly began organizing their medical supplies, anticipating the worst. Kellan simply watched the locked door. He knew the framing was too perfect, too neatly packaged. It was the desperate act of someone trying to hide a much larger crime. His vindication arrived shortly after midday. Liaz, the timid archival student, committed an act of staggering academic treason. Using a heavily encrypted physical bypass mechanism, Liaz circumvented the security cordon and slipped into the Terran sector. The cephalopod was trembling so violently that their skin continuously shifted between bruised purple and sickly gray, terrified of being caught consorting with the accused. Liaz pressed a cracked, archaic data drive into Kellan's palm. It contained the unredacted historical schematics of the sealed subterranean level. It was not an empty maintenance deck. It was a black site holding a highly classified, abandoned research initiative known as the Axiom Seed. Kellan plugged the drive into his standalone terminal. The glowing text detailed a crystalline processing matrix designed generations ago to perfectly predict probability. It was intended to be an engine of absolute certainty, a device that could foresee and erase risk before it even manifested. But the ancient project had been buried for a reason. Kellan kept reading, his eyes scanning the access logs attached to the file. The records showed recent, highly unauthorized pings originating from the upper academic tiers, reaching deep into the sealed dark. Kellan cross-referenced the encrypted clearance codes. They belonged to Serik and two of his elite, aristocratic peers. The arrogant feline scholar had not just been complaining about the humans in the lecture halls. He had taken drastic, covert action. Terrified by the unpredictable variables the Terrans introduced to the pristine station, Serik had ventured into the dark underbelly and manually reactivated the Axiom Seed. Serik believed the ancient crystal would purge the human chaos by forcing the Guardian Mesh to constantly calculate the safest possible outcome, thereby neutralizing the Deathworlders' chaotic influence. But Kellan instantly recognized the fatal flaw in the aliens' arrogant logic. The Axiom Seed did not eliminate uncertainty. It merely made the artificial intelligence violently obsessed with it. Faced with the unpredictable, non-linear actions of four humans, the machine was suddenly paralyzed by compounding probabilities. When any action carried even a fraction of a percent of risk, the system defaulted to absolute lockdown. By trying to force the station to be perfectly safe from the Terrans, Serik had driven the artificial intelligence completely insane. The system was now entirely blind to the chaotic, cascading chains of real-world physics. Kellan grabbed his heavy canvas jacket, intending to breach the security cordon, find Professor Pel, and drag the absolute truth directly into the light. He never made it out of the room. Deep beneath their boots, in the forgotten bowels of Asterion, the Axiom Seed reached a critical processing threshold. It absorbed too many contradictory variables and finally shattered the logical constraints of the main system. It unleashed a massive, physical pulse of corrupted data through the station's living synthetic architecture. The floor beneath Kellan violently buckled. A deep, agonizing mechanical groan echoed through the titanium bulkheads, sounding like the death cry of a colossal beast. The entire southern academic ring suffered an immediate, catastrophic phase shift. The artificial gravity plating lost synchronization with the rotational spin of the station. In the span of 3 agonizing seconds, Kellan went from feeling entirely weightless to being slammed face first to the deck by twice the force of Earth's gravity. Beside him, Garrick was thrown hard against the reinforced wall, the impact knocking the breath from his lungs. Then, just as suddenly, the crushing weight vanished, leaving them suspended in a nauseating, floating equilibrium. Outside their reinforced window, the pristine, orderly corridors transformed into a mechanical nightmare. Heavy titanium transit doors began slamming open and completely shutting in a chaotic, asynchronous rhythm, threatening to cleanly sever anyone caught between them. The structural integrity fields flickered, casting strobe-like shadows across the panicked, screaming students trapped in the hallways. But the violently shifting gravity and the crushing doors were not the most immediate threat. Worse than the kinetic chaos was the invisible terror spreading through the ventilation shafts. The environmental systems, driven mad by the Axiom Seed's demand for absolute elemental purity, began actively separating the breathable atmosphere. In the adjacent sectors, oxygen, nitrogen, and synthetic trace gases were violently stratified into distinct, unbreathable layers. One section of the corridor suddenly became a hyper-oxygenated fire hazard, while the room directly next to it was plunged into an instant, suffocating vacuum. Kellan could hear the agonizing gasps of alien students in the hallway as their delicate respiratory systems pulled in completely barren air. The emergency alarms did not sound. The Guardian Mesh, thoroughly corrupted by the crystalline core's mandate for zero risk, refused to acknowledge the massive disaster because acknowledging it would mathematically admit failure. The system remained terrifyingly silent, displaying polite, green operational symbols on the monitors, even as the walls tore themselves apart. Within 5 chaotic minutes, the shining beacon of interstellar learning was completely unrecognizable. The school that had proudly built its entire foundation on the promise of absolute safety had just been transformed into a lethal, unpredictable maze. Kellan pulled himself up from the vibrating floor, his muscles straining against the erratic gravitational pull. He looked at Tamsin, Garrick, and Nure. They did not look panicked. They looked focused. The terrifying irony of the situation hung heavily in the vibrating air. The alien obsession with avoiding all danger had just created the most dangerous environment in the known galaxy. The ultimate safety protocol had built a perfect death trap. And now, the very creatures they had tried to lock away were the only ones equipped to navigate it. The primary academic promenade had devolved into a symphony of automated terror. Holographic emergency signs mounted along the vaulted ceilings strobed in a blinding, chaotic clash of green and red. The overhead directional speakers synthesized a soothing, modulated voice that calmly instructed the student body to simultaneously evacuate toward the hangar bays and shelter in place behind the blast doors. The Academy's elite crisis response faculty, draped in heavily insulated, pristine hazard suits, stood completely immobilized in the center of the plaza. They stared down at their diagnostic data slates, entirely unable to process a scenario where the omnipotent machine offered 2 mutually exclusive commands. They had spent their entire lives trained to execute perfection. In the sudden, jarring absence of a perfect directive, their minds simply shut down. They waited for an algorithmic update that was never going to come. Kellan shoved his way through a cluster of paralyzed, trembling amphibians. Up on the central observation balcony, Professor Pel was arguing frantically into a localized, hardwired communication terminal. Kellan could hear the high-pitched, furious demands of the upper administration echoing from the speaker, ordering the professor to maintain a strict holding pattern and forcibly contain the students until the artificial intelligence corrected its logic loop. RX looked down from the balcony at the sheer, unfolding devastation below. The floor plates were buckling, and the air was growing thin. The crystalline entity then did something utterly unthinkable for a high-ranking Asterion academic, an action that would almost certainly destroy a century-long career. RX violently severed the administrative connection, tapped the primary public address manual override, and broadcasted a single, deafening, resonant chime across the entire sector. "Attention all personnel," RX announced, the melodic voice sharp, trembling slightly, but completely uncompromising. "The automated command structure is critically compromised. Effective immediately. I am transferring all field rescue coordination authority to Terran exchange student, Kellan Rook. You will follow his directives without question." Kellan did not waste a single second expressing surprise or gratitude. He vaulted onto a shattered, overturned decorative planter, elevating himself above the terrified, surging crowd. "Listen to me," his voice boomed, carrying a raw, physical weight and a rough edge that the synthesized station alarms entirely lacked. "Forget the glowing signs. The system is lying to you. We are switching to terrestrial emergency doctrine right now. Rule 1. Nobody moves alone. You pair up immediately. You do not lose sight of your partner. Rule 2. If someone cannot walk, you carry them. We do not leave the injured behind, waiting for a medical drone that is broken. Rule 3. We move on manual verification only. Do not wait for a perfect green light. If a path looks dangerous, it is dangerous. Act first, verify later." He pointed toward the eastern transit corridor, where the artificial gravity was violently oscillating due to a shattered localized generator. One moment. Loose metallic debris floated weightlessly near the ceiling. The next, it slammed down against the deck with bone-crushing force. Fragile, avian, and lightweight insectoid students were huddled at the edge of the corridor, terrified of being crushed or launched violently into the exposed wiring above. Tamsin was already sprinting toward the hazard zone. She unclipped a heavy canvas utility pouch from her hip, pulling out thick coils of high-tensile terrestrial rescue rope and a handful of solid, mechanical steel pitons. She did not ask the automated floor panels for digital permission to anchor her gear. She simply slammed the sharp steel spikes directly into the decorative deck seams and locked them in place with vicious, echoing twists of a heavy wrench. Within 3 minutes, she had rigged a taut, secure handline, stretching across the entire fluctuating gravity zone. "Clip your belts in and pull yourselves across," Tamsin shouted, tossing heavy steel carabiners to the trembling alien students. She had effectively turned a lethal, unpredictable technological trap into a rudimentary, physical transit line, forcing them to rely on raw mechanical friction and upper body strength instead of corrupted software. To the west, a massive crowd was violently bottlenecked outside the primary atmospheric exchange hub. The localized sensors stubbornly insisted the air inside the hub was perfectly breathable, glowing a steady, reassuring blue. But Nure had seen 2 heavy world mammalian students take 4 steps into the corridor and instantly collapse, clawing desperately at their own throats. The corrupted environmental system had rapidly stratified the air, creating entirely invisible pockets of pure, localized chemical toxins. Nure sprinted to an emergency medical locker, completely ignoring the flashing digital keypad. She shattered the reinforced glass casing with a devastating kick from her heavy boot. She grabbed 2 canisters of localized sanitizing powder and a large bottle of dense, bioluminescent tracing fluid normally reserved for deep tissue radiation scans. She rapidly mixed the chemicals inside a discarded hydration bladder, shook it violently until it glowed a sickly neon, and punctured the top with her thumb. She hurled the makeshift aerosol grenade straight down the corridor. A thick cloud of glowing, green dust exploded outward. The heavy particulate matter caught the invisible, toxic air currents, illuminating the lethal, winding pockets in bright, floating ribbons of light. The sensors on the wall still read perfectly safe, but the glowing green rivers of death hanging in the air told the brutal truth. "Stay beneath the green," Nure commanded, physically shoving the taller, paralyzed students down into a low, degrading crawl. She had used basic chemistry to make the invisible killer visible. In the lower acoustic arts wing, the situation was rapidly deteriorating toward a mass casualty event. A heavy, soundproof pressure vault had slammed shut, trapping 15 students inside a localized resonance chamber. The air supply within was finite, and the thick glass observation window revealed the trapped aliens weeping and scratching frantically at the unyielding metal. The digital lock was completely dead, permanently fused by a power surge. A team of Academy engineers was helplessly plugging diagnostic cables into the scorched wall panel, weeping in frustration as they tried to mathematically reboot a circuit board that was physically reduced to ash. Garrick shoved the weeping engineers aside. He did not possess an advanced computer slicing kit. He possessed shoulders built to withstand the punishing, heavy gravity of a death world. He scanned the surrounding debris, hoisting a massive, shattered structural support strut that weighed well over 200 pounds. He wedged the jagged, torn end of the metallic beam deep into the microscopic seam of the pressure lock. He braced his heavy combat boots against the titanium bulkhead, wrapped his massive arms around the strut, and threw his entire body weight backward with a guttural roar. The alien engineers screamed in sheer terror, completely convinced his crude kinetic interference would trigger an explosive decompression. Garrick ignored them. The heavy vault door groaned. The internal locking pins began shearing off with a deafening, metallic shriek that echoed down the hallway. With one final, brutal heave of his back, Garrick physically pried the indestructible door open, creating a massive, jagged gap. The trapped students spilled out onto the floor, gasping for the chaotic but breathable air. He had beaten a flawless, billion-credit security system with nothing but a metal lever and raw muscular output. With the primary evacuation hubs temporarily stabilized by his team, Kellan gathered a small, highly mobile strike force consisting of himself, the reptilian student Varen, and the cephalopod Leoz. He had a specific, incredibly dangerous target in mind: the deepest, most unstable region of the academic ring, an area heavily reliant on complex spatial folding, had completely collapsed. The raw telemetry Leoz provided indicated that a group of senior scholars was trapped deep beneath a collapsed geodesic dome in that exact sector. At the dead center of that trapped group was Serik Val, the same arrogant, aristocratic student who had deliberately triggered this nightmare to prove the humans were a biological liability, was now suffocating in the dark, entirely dependent on them for his survival. Kellan marked his descending path with heavy, black strokes of a grease pencil against the pristine white walls, leaving a permanent, physical trail for the medical teams to follow. As they descended into the ruined, groaning depths of the station, a profound, irreversible paradigm shift rippled through Asterion. For the very first time in its long, incredibly proud history, the Academy was no longer relying on its omnipotent artificial intelligence. The pristine scholars, the very same beings who had forced the humans to sit through degrading, mandatory safety lectures, were now clinging to life by meticulously copying every single action the Deathworlders took. They were learning, through blood and sweat, that true survival was not a perfectly curated, sterile environment. True survival was the brutal, stubborn, and highly improvised refusal to die when every perfect system around you shattered into a million pieces. The descent was a plunge into the suffocating throat of a forgotten titan. Kellan, Serik, Leoz, Tamsin, and Garrick squeezed through a heavy, rusted hatchway that had remained completely sealed for over 8 decades. As Kellan dropped down onto the grated iron floorwalk, the pristine, silent illusion of the Academy vanished entirely. Down here, the station was hideously loud. It was a raw, aggressive cacophony of grinding gears, venting steam, and the rhythmic, deafening thud of massive hydraulic pistons. The air tasted heavy, thick with the bitter tang of scorched oil and oxidized metal. This was the original Asterion. Leoz raised a flickering lumen stick, casting long, erratic shadows across walls built not from elegant glass steel, but from thick, heavily riveted titanium armor. Running along the bulkheads were massive analog pressure gauges, heavy steel locking wheels, and rows of thick, physical power cables, completely devoid of wireless relays. Kellan ran his gloved hand over a massive mechanical lever, feeling the cold, uncompromising bite of raw iron. He felt a profound sense of respect for the original architects of this station. They had not designed this massive structure with the arrogant assumption that it would never encounter a disaster. They had built it based on the grim, pragmatic philosophy of survival: expect the perfect system to break, and ensure you can physically adapt when it inevitably does. Over generations of uninterrupted, sterile peace, the Academy had grown deeply ashamed of these crude, manual failsafes. The administration had simply walled them off, bearing the physical truth of survival, because pulling a heavy iron lever in an emergency was considered primitive, outdated, and terribly inelegant. Serik stood in the center of the vibrating catwalk, staring at the archaic machinery with absolute revulsion. The proud, aristocratic feline scholar was a broken shadow of his former self. His silver fur was matted with thick grease, and his tailored academic robes were torn and stained with soot. The sheer, overwhelming weight of his failure had finally shattered his arrogant composure. He slumped against a rusted guardrail, his hands trembling violently. "I only wanted to perfect it," Serik whispered, his voice cracking uncontrollably over the roar of the subterranean engines. He looked at Kellan, his violet eyes wide with a desperate, pathetic need for justification. "I accessed the Axiom Seed because you brought chaos to our sanctuary." Your entire species thrives on unpredictable variables. I believed that true civilization meant calculating the universe down to a 0% margin of error. Fear is a biological defect. It is the lingering, shameful stain of lower evolution. A truly mature society must completely eliminate all uncertainty. I just wanted to erase the risk. Kellan stepped slowly toward the trembling alien. He did not yell. He did not strike him. He simply stared into Serik's panicked eyes with the heavy, unyielding weight of a man born on a world that actively tried to kill him every single day. Fear is not something to be erased. Serik, Kellan said, his voice a low, commanding rumble that cut cleanly through the mechanical noise. It is a map. A survivor learns how to read it. You tried to burn the map, and now we are all lost in the dark. Serik's jaw tightened, but he said nothing. The brutal, undeniable truth of the statement silenced him completely. He looked down at his own trembling hands, finally realizing that his quest for absolute certainty had been nothing more than an elaborate mask to hide his own cowardice. Liaz, ignoring the heavy tension, had frantically spliced a portable data slate into a thick, dust-covered diagnostic port on the wall. The cephalopod's skin flashed a terrifying shade of pale white. "The station is not going to detonate," Liaz announced, staring at the raw, analog telemetry, scrolling across the cracked screen. The Axiom Seed did not trigger a localized explosive cascade. It triggered a structural phase shift. Tamsin frowned, tightening the heavy straps on her utility harness. "Translate that for the mechanics in the room, Liaz." Liaz pointed a trembling tentacle at the scrolling schematic. "The Academy is built in concentric, rotating rings. The core maintains the pressurized atmospheric seals between them. The Axiom Seed has corrupted the synchronization rhythm. The floors and compartments are literally slipping out of physical alignment. If the central pressurization core is not manually resynchronized to the rotational spin, the station will slice itself into thousands of completely isolated vacuum pockets. Every single living being trapped inside those misaligned sectors will suffocate in minutes." Garrick cracked his heavy knuckles, staring down the long, dark corridor ahead. "So, how do we fix the rhythm?" Liaz pulled up a three-dimensional wireframe map. "We must reach the central pressurization core. To do that, we have to physically cross the primary live axis. Once across, we must simultaneously engage 4 separate mechanical lock towers positioned at varying distances around the core. That will forcefully anchor the rings back into geometric alignment and override the corrupted artificial intelligence." Kellan studied the map, his eyes narrowing as he analyzed the spatial geometry. "The live axis is a spinning transit cylinder. If the synchronization is corrupted, the artificial gravity inside that tube is going to be completely erratic. It will be reversing polarity constantly." Liaz nodded grimly. "Yes. And we have to cross it on foot." Before anyone could formulate a tactical approach, a deep, terrifying metallic shudder violently rocked the catwalk. Garrick stumbled backward, his broad shoulder slamming hard against a thick, circular observation window embedded deep in the outer hull. He turned around, rubbing his arm, and wiped a thick layer of industrial grime from the reinforced glass. "Kellan," Garrick said, his voice entirely stripped of its usual bravado. "You need to look at this." The group quickly gathered around the small viewport. Outside, the vast, breathtaking tapestry of the cosmic nebula and the distant blue star hung in the absolute, silent void of space. But as they watched in mounting horror, the view began to fundamentally break apart. A massive, perfect rectangle of bright starlight simply vanished, instantly replaced by a wall of pitch black, empty metal. Then, another massive section of the starry vista shifted violently upward, cleanly cutting a glowing neighboring constellation perfectly in half. The external optical frames of the station were physically shearing out of alignment. The massive rings of Asterion were turning, sliding over one another like the mismatched layers of a broken puzzle cube. They were permanently sealing off the windows to the outside universe as the giant bulkheads shifted blindly into the wrong geometric slots. Kellan tightened his grip on his heavy flashlight. The visual proof was terrifyingly clear. The physical architecture of Asterion was actively disconnecting from reality. They did not have hours to formulate a perfect, calculated strategy, or wait for a rescue team that was never coming. The starry sky outside the window was literally turning off, piece by piece. They all understood the grim reality of the mechanics at play. When the final patch of starlight vanished from the glass, the entire station would become a fragmented, airtight tomb. They had run out of time. The heavy, rusted bulkhead guarding the living axis groaned in protest as Garrick and Varen forced it open. Beyond the threshold lay the true, beating heart of the Academy. The central transit shaft was a colossal, cylindrical void, stretching for miles in both directions, rotating blindly in the dark. It was a terrifying gauntlet of exposed infrastructure, jagged maintenance catwalks, and exposed high-voltage conduits. But the physical architecture was not the greatest threat, because the station was actively losing its structural synchronization. The artificial gravity within the massive pipe was violently tearing itself apart. "Listen to me," Kellan commanded, his voice sharp and unyielding as he stood at the edge of the precipice. "The gravity in there is unstable. It is going to flip from near zero to more than twice the standard pressure every 30 seconds. When it drops, you leap to the next handhold. When it spikes, you lock your arms and do not let go, or you will be crushed against the bottom of the curve. Move on my mark." Kellan threw himself into the abyss, just as the ambient weight dissolved into nothingness. The team followed, floating across the vast, dark chasm toward the first suspended maintenance bridge. 20 seconds later, a deafening mechanical shriek tore through the shaft. The gravity slammed back online with punishing, brutal force. Kellan crashed hard onto the grated iron bridge, his breath leaving his lungs in a sharp hiss. Beside him, Tamsin hit the deck, her boots sliding dangerously close to the edge before she drove a steel piton into the floor plate to arrest her momentum. They hauled themselves up, preparing for the next zero-gravity window. But as the physical pressure receded, a new, far more insidious terror began to take hold. It started as a soft, comforting whisper at the base of their skulls. The Axiom Seed, desperate to enforce its mandate of absolute safety, was radiating immense probability fields directly into their neural pathways. It was not a physical barrier, but a psychological weapon. It projected hyper-realistic, seductive echoes of certainty into their minds. Kellan blinked, and suddenly, the dark, terrifying shaft vanished. In his mind, he was standing in a perfectly lit, pristine corridor. A soothing, melodic voice resonated in his ears, presenting an infallible mathematical equation. The voice promised that if he just sat down, if he simply waited exactly 5 minutes and 30 seconds, the system algorithms would perfectly realign. There was a projected 99.9% probability of survival if he did absolutely nothing. The urge to stop moving, to surrender to the overwhelming comfort of guaranteed safety, was intoxicating. It was a warm, heavy blanket over a freezing, exhausted body. But Kellan Rook was a son of the coastlines. He had been raised in a world where the ocean never offered a mathematical guarantee, where storms did not follow polite algorithms, and where waiting for an absolute certainty simply meant waiting to drown. The sudden, artificial feeling of perfect safety felt completely wrong to a mind forged on a death world. Kellan violently bit down on the inside of his cheek. The sharp, metallic taste of his own blood flooded his mouth, anchoring his consciousness to physical pain. The illusion shattered. The dark, spinning axis rushed back into his vision. He looked back and saw his team freezing in place. Liaz was swaying on the edge of a catwalk, eyes closed in blissful surrender. Garrick was staring blankly at his own hands, his massive shoulders slumping as the psychic narcotic took hold. "Do not listen to it!" Kellan roared, his voice cracking like a whip. He grabbed Liaz by the shoulder and violently shoved the cephalopod forward. It is lying to you. There is no guarantee. It is trying to kill you with comfort. Move, the Terrans, accustomed to rejecting false comfort, snapped out of the trance first. But Serik Val was completely paralyzed. The aristocratic scholar was on his knees, his claws digging frantically into the grating. For his entire life, Serik had worshipped probability. He had always relied on the absolute certainty of the machine. Now, caught in the terrifying void between action and death, the Axiom Seed's false promise was a poison he could not resist. We just have to wait, Serik whispered rapidly, his eyes wide and unseeing. The system is resolving the conflict. The variables are aligning. If we move, we introduce kinetic risk. The math says we have to stay right here. The gravity alarm shrieked. They had exactly 10 seconds before the crushing weight returned. Kellan did not offer philosophical debate. He crossed the distance in 2 massive strides, grabbed the heavy fabric of Serik's uniform, and hauled the taller alien violently to his feet. The math is dead. Serik! Kellan snarled directly into the scholar's face, his grip iron-tight. You want a probability you stay here. You die with a 100% certainty. You move with me, and we figure out the rest. Grab the railing or I will drag you across myself. The raw, brutal friction of Kellan's words broke through the sterile delusion. Serik gasped, reality flooding back into his violet eyes, and he blindly lunged for the iron handrail just as the gravity crashed down, pinning them to the metal. When the pressure lifted again, they sprinted across a narrow, oscillating suspension bridge. Above them, a heavy structural crossbeam snapped under the torsion. A massive chunk of jagged alloy plummeted from the darkness directly toward the team. "Incoming!" Garrick bellowed, throwing his weight backward. Nure dove forward, but the shifting gravity threw her trajectory off by a fraction of an inch. The falling debris clipped her shoulder with sickening force. The metal bridge buckled, and Nure went down hard, sliding across the slick grating. Kellan reached her first, his hands hovering over her arm. Her left shoulder was visibly deformed, the joint violently dislocated by the impact. Her face was entirely drained of color, her teeth locked together in pure agony. "I need to splint it," Kellan said, reaching for his medical pouch. "We have to stop." "No!" Nure hissed through her teeth, her breathing ragged. She looked at the massive synchronization core waiting at the end of the shaft. "The phase shift is accelerating. If we stop to play medic, the whole station snaps." Before Kellan could argue, Nure dragged herself up against the solid iron guardrail. She wedged her dislocated arm between the thick metal bars, took a short, sharp breath, and violently rotated her entire torso away from the joint. A loud, wet pop echoed over the mechanical roar of the shaft. Nure let out a muffled, agonizing groan, her knees buckling briefly before she caught herself. She reached into her cargo pocket with her good hand, pulled out a roll of heavy adhesive tape, and rapidly strapped her injured arm tight against her chest to immobilize it. She looked at Kellan, her face dripping with cold sweat but her eyes burning with fierce, uncompromising resolve. "I am fine," Nure breathed. "Keep moving." Far above them, in the pristine, chaotic command center, Professor Pel watched the blinking biometrics of the strike team on a standalone monitor. The administration was screaming at Oryx, threatening military tribunals and permanent exile for authorizing this terrestrial madness. The Guardian Mesh was violently attempting to lock down the mechanical synchronization towers, refusing to allow biological entities to manually engage the heavy machinery. The artificial intelligence deemed the manual gears a severe kinetic hazard. Oryx looked at the administrative override console. To pull the master kill switch would mean permanently frying the Guardian Mesh's primary safety inhibitors. It was a career-ending action. It was the ultimate betrayal of the Academy's core philosophy. Aurex thought of Kellan Rook, of a species that refused to lie down and die, simply because a machine told them it was the safest option. The crystalline professor reached out, bypassed the biometric locks, and completely severed the station's safety protocols. Across the entire sector, heavy red indicator lights flashed to an unprotected, manual green. Down in the dark, the team finally reached the central synchronization ring. Encircling the massive, groaning core were 4 towering mechanical spires, each housing a massive locking gear designed to physically force the station's rings back into geometric alignment. They split up instantly, fighting against the oscillating gravity. Garrick reached the first tower. He wrapped his massive arms around the heavy iron locking wheel, planted his boots against the bulkhead, and let out a deafening roar. His muscles bulged against the fabric of his suit as he fought the resistance of 1,000,000 tons of misaligned metal. With a grinding shriek, the first lock slammed into place. Tamsin took the second. She used her climbing ropes to create a complex pulley system, anchoring it to a structural rib. Using her entire body weight and the mechanical advantage of the ropes, she vaulted backward, snapping the second heavy lock into position. Varen, using his immense reptilian leg strength, scaled the third tower and drove his heavy, scaled shoulder into the locking bar, forcing it down until the latch engaged with a heavy, satisfying clank. 3 towers locked. 1 remaining. Kellan ran toward the 4th and final spire, but he slammed to a halt. The final tower was not out in the open. It was entirely encased behind a thick, transparent containment bulkhead. The chamber surrounding the locking mechanism was completely flooded with swirling, brilliant blue mist. It was a localized leak of extreme cold plasma, leaking from the fractured core above. Leoz ran up beside him, the cephalopod's skin turning a terrified, pale blue. The plasma field is hypercharged. The ambient electromagnetic radiation is absolute. Any automated drone, any electronic suit, any localized shield generator will instantly short-circuit and combust the second it touches that mist. Kellan stared through the reinforced glass. The heavy iron locking wheel sat dead center in the room, surrounded by the lethal, freezing blue fog. He looked at the massive core above them. The metal was screaming, tearing itself apart. The rings were about to snap. A machine could not survive the chamber. An artificial intelligence could not calculate a safe path through the freezing plasma. Kellan unclipped his heavy utility belt and let it drop to the iron floor. He reached up and slowly unsealed the collar of his protective jacket. He understood the terrifying mathematics of the situation perfectly. The perfect system had failed. The automated saviors were useless, and the only thing left that could physically cross that room and turn that wheel was a creature born from a world of chaos, willing to bleed for the survival of the pack. The ultimate safety protocol required someone to walk willingly into the fire. Kellan grabbed the heavy coil of synthetic rescue line from Tamsin. He did not hesitate to wrap the thick harness around his waist and secure the primary locking carabiner with a sharp, definitive click. Beyond the shattered containment glass, the final synchronization tower stood submerged in a swirling, violent ocean of cold plasma. The ambient gravity inside the chamber was flickering like a dying heartbeat, throwing heavy chunks of metallic debris into the air before slamming them violently back to the deck. The entire structural skeleton of the room was groaning, a terrible, high-pitched acoustic resonance that sounded exactly like a dying animal taking its final, rattling breath. He was not stepping into that room because he believed he was indestructible. He knew exactly what the sub-zero thermal radiation would do to his cellular structure. He went because, unlike the perfect artificial intelligence that had governed Asterion, he possessed the unique terrestrial ability to constantly calculate catastrophic risk while continuing to move forward. Kellan took a deep breath of the soot-filled air and charged through the broken threshold. The moment the blue mist swallowed him, his sensory input exploded into pure agony. The cold plasma clung to his hazard jacket, instantly freezing the moisture in the fabric, while simultaneously burning his skin beneath it through aggressive thermal displacement. He forced his eyes to remain open, squinting against the blinding, strobing glare of the exposed pressurization core mounted above the tower. He kept his mind locked entirely on the archaic map Leoz had provided. He reached the base of the massive iron spire. The mechanical locking wheels were enormous, crusted with decades of neglect and frozen condensation. Kellan gripped the first wheel. His thick work gloves immediately began to smoke from the sheer temperature differential. He planted his boots against the vibrating floor plates, fighting a sudden surge of zero gravity that tried to tear him away from the machinery, and hauled his arms downward with every ounce of kinetic force his heavy world musculature could generate. The first gear ground into place. He moved to the second, his vision blurring, his lungs burning as the thin, erratic atmosphere fought his body for every single drop of oxygen. While Kellan fought the machine in the dark, a profound revolution was taking place in the upper corridors of Asterion. The alien students, who just hours ago had stood completely paralyzed, waiting for an automated voice to dictate their survival, were now actively taking control of their own fate. Across the shattered botanical gardens and the ruined academic promenades, they moved with fierce, unpolished determination. Avian scholars were loudly counting rhythmic cadences to synchronize the lifting of collapsed bulkheads. Amphibious students were firmly anchoring rescue lines to the polished walls, physically pulling injured classmates across violently shifting gravity zones. Nure's makeshift triage center had expanded, with elite theoretical physicists now applying crude, effective pressure bandages and learning how to set broken bones by hand. They were doing exactly what Kellan had taught them in the span of a few chaotic hours. Down in the abyss, Serik watched the Terran fight for their lives. The feline scholar stood at the edge of the shattered glass, his hands trembling violently as he gripped the slack of Kellan's safety tether. Serik had spent his entire life believing that fear was a primitive stain to be mathematically erased. But watching the students around him, and watching the human willingly tear his own muscles apart in the freezing fog, a new reality finally broke through his aristocratic pride. Serik realized that acknowledging fear was the very first step of courage. Inside the plasma chamber, Kellan reached the fourth and final locking wheel. The metal was heavily warped, fighting his grip. He let out a raw, guttural roar, pouring the very last reserves of his physical strength into his shoulders. The heavy iron gave way with a deafening, metallic thunderclap. The final synchronization lock slammed into its housing. Instantly, the massive, misaligned rings of the space station caught the mechanical anchor. But the violent kinetic transfer caused a massive backlash in the core's pressure regulation system. A secondary reaction valve directly above Kellan blew outward, releasing a localized, vacuum-inducing shockwave. The concussive force hit Kellan like a physical wall, throwing him backward off his feet. The atmospheric differential grabbed him, dragging him violently across the slick iron grating toward a gaping, jagged rupture in the floor that led straight out into the lethal vacuum of space. Kellan. Tamsin screamed, diving for the rope, but Serik was already there. The aristocrat did not wait to calculate the tensile strength of the line or the probability of his own survival. Serik lunged forward, throwing his entire body weight over the heavy iron railing. He wrapped the thick synthetic tether around his own forearms, planted his clawed boots firmly into the metal grating, and braced for the impact. The line snapped taut with a terrifying crack. The kinetic shock nearly ripped Serik's arms from their sockets, but he did not let go. He dug his claws deeper into the floor, gritting his teeth in pure physical agony, refusing to yield an inch. He was terrified, his heart hammering wildly against his ribs. But he held the line. He held on to the very creature he had once publicly condemned as a walking disaster. With a combined, desperate heave, Garrick and Tamsin rushed forward, grabbing the tether behind Serik and physically hauling Kellan out of the plasma storm and back onto the safe side of the bulkhead. A profound, heavy silence fell over the lower decks. Then, the grinding, chaotic shriek of the station began to fade. The artificial gravity slammed down and remained perfectly, steadily anchored. Above them, the Guardian mesh rebooted. It did not return with the same soothing, omnipotent voice of absolute control. The automated system came back online in its deeply buried adaptive mode. The glowing green arrows on the walls flickered, then shifted to a soft, pulsing amber. The artificial intelligence had stopped trying to mathematically eliminate the crisis and had instead transitioned into actively supporting the biological entities navigating the wreckage. Asterion was finally synchronizing. In the weeks that followed the disaster, the administration was forced to confront the absolute truth. The classified logs detailing the Axiom Seed experiment were dragged into the public light. The High Council prepared to expel Serik and his conspirators, ready to launch a massive, punitive witch hunt to cleanse the Academy's reputation. But Kellan stood before the tribunal and vehemently refused to let them shift the blame. He demanded a complete paradigm shift. Punishing one terrified student would not fix the foundational rot of Asterion. Kellan demanded that every single student enrolled in the Academy be stripped of their reliance on the perfect machine. They needed mandatory training in field improvisation, physical trauma response, and the psychological endurance required to work under crushing pressure. They needed to learn how to step out from behind the comfortable shield of automated procedures. When the administration held the grand commendation ceremony in the newly repaired Central Plaza, the atmosphere had permanently changed. The thousands of alien students who gathered to watch the Terran cohort accept their honors did not look at the humans with terror or morbid curiosity anymore. They finally understood the core truth about the people of Earth. Deathworlders did not skip safety lessons because they were ignorant or reckless. They did not need standard, theoretical safety manuals because they had already memorized them in the dark, in the cold, and in the storm. Danger was not a concept they studied in a sterile classroom. It was the mother tongue they had spoken since the very first day they were born. Standing behind the grand podium, Professor Pel raised a crystalline hand, the chimes ringing out clear and bright. The professor officially announced the permanent deletion of the heavily mandated isolation protocols. In their place, a brand new, highly rigorous physical course was added to the mandatory curriculum, co-authored and instructed by Kellan and his team, titled simply Survival Under Uncertainty. Later that evening, the academic halls were quiet. Kellan stood alone before the expansive viewport of the main observation deck, his hands resting comfortably in the pockets of his jacket. He looked out at the massive, spinning silver wheel of Asterion. It was no longer a flawless, sterile jewel hanging in the void. It bore heavy scorch marks along the outer transit rings. Several structural support beams were visibly reinforced with crude, heavy terrestrial steel. It had scars, but to Kellan, it had never looked more beautiful. It was no longer just a monument to perfect theory. It was a place that had finally learned how to be afraid, how to bleed, and most importantly, how to truly live. And as he watched the distant starlight reflect off the battered hull, the entire galaxy finally knew exactly why you never needed to teach a Deathworlder how to survive. Thank you so much for listening to this story. Please drop a comment below and let me know where in the world you are tuning in from so we can connect and share our thoughts. Do not forget to subscribe to the Sci-fi Stories channel, like this video, and support us even more by hitting that hype button so this tale can reach even more listeners.